So I'm going to introduce the panelists for this morning's panel up front. We're going to leave them in the audience so they don't have the awkwardness of shifting and looking at the screen. But after I do the introductions, go ahead and come up in the order that you're listed and give your presentation. Okay, so Scott Revell has been the manager of the 72,000-acre Roza Irrigation District in the Yakima Valley since 2013. Prior to that, he was the planning manager for the Kennewick Irrigation District for 7 years. He holds master's and bachelor's degrees from Washington State University in public administration and history, respectively. Les Perkins started his career as a microbiologist in the fermentation industry before leaving to help the Skagit Farmers Conservation Alliance, start the Farmers Conservation Alliance. He's helped develop 35 fish screen projects in 5 western states during his 10 years at FCA. In late 2015, Les took the manager position at Farmers Irrigation District, which serves 6,000 acres of farmland in the Hood River Valley and produces nearly 26 million kilowatt hours of certified hydropower annually. Kevin Chambers is a fifth-generation Oregon farmer born in Salem and raised in Eugene. While studying for his degree in telecommunications at journalism at the University of Oregon, he took a part-time job in the Oregon's wine industry, and upon graduation became a full-time person in the wine industry and has worked in a number of different companies in the wine industry, including owning several and starting several businesses and selling them. Most recently, he's taken the proceeds from the sale of one of his businesses and purchased land in the high in the Ilula Amity Hills to develop the Coosa Farm, a permaculture vineyard, orchard, and pasture operation. Along the way, Kevin has developed a keen sense of interest in soils and plants, ultimately becoming an agronomic consultant, working in several cropping systems, and has dedicated his professional life to serving Oregon agriculture. Jay Gordon was the executive director of the Washington State Dairy Federation from 2000 to 2014, and more recently has become the policy director. His role in policy includes supporting and representing the interests of dairy farmers in Washington State at the legislature with a variety of state and federal agencies, national dairy organizations, local livestock, and shellfish growers. Promoting the dairy industry while working to provide solutions for environmental and health issues such as nutrient management regulation, air and water regulation, and animal identification. Jay also owns a dairy farm near Elma, where he primarily manages the crops on that farm. Kat Brigham is a member of the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation, whose families are fishers on the Columbia River. Her husband, Robert, fished at Celio before it was flooded in 1957. They have 3 daughters, 6 grandchildren, 4 great-grandchildren, and all of them have fished or are going to fish on the Columbia River on the scaffolds or with gill nets that have been used for generations. Not only do their lives depend on fishing, but their culture and traditions. Fishing, a reserved treaty right that is in the CTUIR 1855 treaty, with which the Brighams and other members of the tribe expect the governing body to protect for the next seven generations and beyond. Kat's family have fished, taken care of fish, and sold to the public for decades. 3 years ago, they worked with the port and the city of Cascade Locks to open Brigham Fish Market in Cascade Locks, just east of the Best Western Hotel. Bill Dewey is, since receiving his degree in shellfish biology at the University of Washington, he's worked as a shellfish farmer for over 35 years in Washington State. He's the Director of Public Affairs for Taylor Shellfish Farms. Based in Shelton, Washington, they are the largest producer of farmed shellfish in the United States. Bill also owns and operates his own clam farm in Samish Bay. He served on the Washington State's Ocean Acidification Blue Ribbon Panel in 2011 and currently serves on the Washington Marine Resources Advisory Council, which advises Governor Jay Inslee and the legislature on the state's response to ocean acidification. Mary Lou Soscia has worked for state, federal, and tribal government for over 37 years, specializing in watershed and river protection and restoration efforts. Mary Lou was on the team that created EPA's National Estuary Program and worked to get congressional authorization for the program in the 1987 Clean Water Act amendments. Since 1997, Mary Lou has served on as the Columbia River Coordinator for the U.S. EPA Region 10. She's worked on a number of issues in toxics reduction and water quality standards, and she provides senior EPA representation on the Columbia River Treaty work efforts. Mary has a BA in Geography from Virginia Tech and an MA in Geography from the University of Maryland. So you can see we have a very impressive panel, and we're going to just turn it over to them and listen to them. Scott.
Well, thank you very much. It's good to be here. Always appreciate the opportunity to come talk, and I'll just kind of give you a little background here. Whoop. How do I get it to advance, Liz? Oh, there we go. Is everybody here familiar with the Yakima Basin, more or less? You know, you've got up at the top here, you've got 3 federal reservoirs owned by and operated by the Bureau of Reclamation. Seattle would be over here about 50 miles. Yakima is in the middle, Tri-Cities down at the bottom by the confluence with the Columbia. The Roza Irrigation District is 72,000 acres, about 95 miles long, and it's the pink district. The Umatilla Irrigation Project, which is on the Yakima Indian Reservation, is the tan color, and the Kittitas District, Reclamation District, and I'm also standing in for Urban Everhart, who is the manager of the Kittitas District. He had a conflict today. We all get our water from the Yakima River. Roza's roughly 80% in permanent crops. That's things like hops, wine grapes, juice grapes, also Concord grapes and Niagaras, tree fruits, cherries, peaches, apples, things like that. On a good year when everyone is making money, probably approaches about $1 billion in total crop value. Our water supply goes up and down in drought years, and we've got another slide to show you that. It's ranged from as low as 35% in I think 2001 and 2005. We've got 54 employees. Our total budget's about $13 million, and we put a pretty healthy chunk of that into capital improvements, particularly those that conserve water. This is what Honeycrisp apples look like when they're running down the line. It's kind of an interesting photo. Took that in one of our processing facilities that one of our board of directors owns. If you ever come on a tour with us, and I'd like to invite anyone if you'd like to learn more, feel free to come on a tour. If you do it in the summer, we can stop by. And you can usually grab a couple apples off the line. It's just fascinating to watch the technology that's going into this. We have in the Yakima Basin 4 different categories of water rights. There are those that are senior, which are pre-1905, those that are proratable, which are May 10, 1905 and later. Roza's in this group here, and we actually get reduced in a drought year. So in 2015, for example, we received about 44. We were down to 44% at one point and finished the season at 47%. There are a category called the juniors down here. They get cut off entirely in a drought. We've never had a drought that was so bad that the proratables were at 0 and the seniors were starting to get reduced by priority date. It's theoretically possible, but it hasn't happened yet. During 2015, started off in March, 73% was the official forecast. That's actually the Bureau of Reclamation is not allowed to make a forecast before early March. The water season can change dramatically with just a couple of storms. It can get better. It can also get worse. In 2015, it actually got worse, and so a month later, we were at 60%. Stomachs started to tighten. We got a mid-month forecast in April. One of the things I learned is that they don't give you good news when it's in the middle of the month. So the river switched over to storage control on April 15th, and what that means is the natural flow of the river was then being supplemented by releases from the reservoirs. And it's at that point we're burning down our bucket of water until the end of the irrigation season. It's the earliest it had ever happened. Usually it happens in mid to late June. At that point, we called an emergency meeting of the board, and I'll talk about that here in just a minute. But you can see we went all the way down here to 44%, and each percent is really important because in our district, that's 44% of 375,000 acre feet. And what that means, each percentage point when we're running at bare minimum flows, the lowest we can possibly run at to keep the canal operating, each percentage point is about 4 days of run time. And so when we're down in the 40s, we're at the absolute bare minimum of whether or not our system can operate or not. We did a number of things in 2015. We actually cut people back to about 25% of design capacity. Did it immediately when that decision was made to switch the river over to reservoir control. Shut the canal system down, managed to fill up the room with farmers who had not been coming to the board meetings. I'd been there a year and a half, hadn't had a single farmer, and suddenly we had 50 in the room in one day. Turns out they do pay attention when you turn the water off. We leased as much water as possible. This number is not correct here. We actually leased 4,500 acre feet, and we had 5,000 acre feet of pump backs that's water recovered from an adjacent irrigation district where we paid them. So I lumped them in here. It's a little bit less than that. The leasing that we did, essentially, we spent about $1.4 million to lease that water. We leased everything we could. We'd have been happy to lease more, actually, significantly more. We had upped our price by about 2/3, got probably 15 to 20% of what we had leased 10 years prior in the prior drought in 2005. The end result was we were spending $250,000 a day to keep the system operating in September. We worked with ecology on emergency well permits. 90% of the permits in the basin are on the Roza. And then we adaptively managed our water budget when the temperature went up and down. There were a couple times where the temperature dipped later in the summer. We were able to cut it back a little bit to stretch the season out. Our board of directors, their philosophy was stretch the season out as long as possible to help the crops that need late season water, like apples, grapes, and hops, for example. This is what the main canal looks like when you empty it at the headworks, and this was in May. Got a couple things going on here in this photo. Got a pump back. That's what a $55,000 pump looks like next to a hop yard. These are all trickle irrigated hops. A lot of weeds there, so this one's probably an organic field. Got a concrete line section of canal. The concrete line sections leak like a sieve. There's this false belief that if they're lined with concrete, then they're not leaking. They actually leak more because they don't fill up with the sediment. So there's a drain system that the canal was built with in the 40s to recover some of that water, so we can hook a pump up here, and that's what 700 gallons a minute looks like right there coming out of that pipe. This is a cornfield. A lot of farmers will keep a piece of their farm in open ground for an annual crop like corn or hay or something like that, and then they'll just fallow it during a drought and move the water to their higher value crops. We've had a very aggressive water conservation program since 1983. We've put roughly, at this point, not quite $30 million into our system, almost all grower funded. That has piped more or less, approaching 300 miles of canals. Our crews are out there. I've got a picture here where I've been out in the last couple weeks working through all this bad weather. We've got the system up to a point where we can operate it significantly lower than when it was first built. And a lot of this stems from the 1977 drought. The district made a series of strategic decisions and really invested heavily. It's one of the most aggressive conservation programs in the West. And one thing that often gets overlooked are the on-farm grower efficiency measures, and that's things like ponds that they install, sprinkler conversions. Virtually all of the blueberries, all of the hops, and almost all of the wine grapes are now trickle irrigated. Many of the high percentage of the high density apple orchards, for example, are also either trickle irrigated or they have under tree spray. We have spent a tremendous amount of money on this canal sealing program where we seal the cracks in the concrete. That's about $300,000 per mile. We've got about 5 miles to go, so it's something that we're chipping away at. We're very aggressive in applying for grants. The state of Washington actually paid for that work to be done. This was last spring. Here's our crews out. This was last Thursday, so they really didn't stop with the bad weather. So we're piping a lateral canal here. We do about 8 to 12 miles of pipe a year. We've got 14 more years to go. Here's our crews a couple weeks ago pouring concrete in the middle of the main canal, replacing the part of it where it was the most leaky. So they'll come in and we'll spray that with that blue sealant. It's kind of like it's almost like an elastic toothpaste, actually. These are the measures that we use during a drought year, and we have kind of a sliding scale depending on the water supply forecast over here, and we trigger these different measures. And so we'll shut the canal off. We've never done a double shutdown. We're prepared to do it in the future. That is predicated on a very favorable storage control date. Now, favorable means the earlier in the season, the better, because if we shut the system down twice for a shorter period rather than one long period, we think we can gain more days at the end of the season. When I say favorable, that's also not favorable because it means that we have such a bad year that we're switching over to storage control early. But in terms of managing the limited supply, the earlier it happens, in some cases actually the better, because it gives us another couple tools. The reality is, by by early June, we've pretty much done everything we can do. There's not a lot left because we've leased all the water at that point that we can lease. We've already done a shutdown. We're probably not going to do a shutdown in July or August. And in 2015, it was 113 degrees for 2 days. No amount of water is going to fix that. That's unusually hot for us. These are what peach trees look like when they've been removed. In this case, in 2015, the farmer did the harvest and looked like they were healthy trees, pushed them over, moved the water to another crop. One of the measures we're working on in the long term is Lake Cochise, or emergency pumping plant. If you've ever been, this is Interstate 90 would be here. Seattle's off this way about 50 miles. Ellensburg's down here about 40 miles. We've got a emergency or floating pumping plant that we're working on here to access. This lake's about 300 feet deep. It would take the top 80 feet out of the inactive storage pool. It's not very popular with the neighbors. About 300 people live over here and over here. It's in the environmental impact statement process right now. Probably a couple years away from happening, but we would be allowed to use it in a drought year only to get up to 70% supply. Would be fully funded by the growers. Very expensive to operate. We only want to use it for the minimum amount of time possible that we have to because of the operating expenses. I would be remiss if I did not note my colleague, Mr. Eberhardt, who is here, very energetic guy. Sometimes you'll see him around. He has a kind of a bowler top hat. He sticks out in a crowd. He's not wearing it in this picture, unfortunately. He was the driving force behind this creek supplementation program. And the way that worked is water that came out of the reservoirs was diverted from the main stem of the Yakima River into the Kittitas District Canal. Now, their canal had extra space in it because they'd been prorated. They were only getting a little less than half of their normal supply. We have here in the photo Tom Eisman, who up until last Friday was the Assistant Secretary of Interior. Our federal affairs lobbyist, Mark Limbaugh, who previously was the Assistant Secretary of Interior back during the George W. Bush administration. And what we did was ran our water down through the canal, and it was our water and others. Urban's crews went out and over the course of a couple of weekends, in some cases, installed these pipes to siphon water out of their canal into these creeks. And so at 9 different creeks that were drying up, or in some cases had completely dried up, we were able to get at least a limited amount of water, a couple of CFS in there, because we had these little pools that were disconnected, and they had 3 different age classes of ESA-listed steelhead in them, along with other aquatic species and trout and things like that. Just tremendous cooperation that never would have happened in the past. You've probably heard we're working on a basin-wide plan. We're implementing that plan over the last several years. That's the kind of thing that, in my view, is one of the better results of having good, strong working relationships, and is definitely an adaptation to a change in climate that certainly would not have happened about 20 years ago. So with that, I'll turn it over to Les, and we'll take questions at the end.
So I'll do my best. I've got a bit of a cold, so my voice has been coming and going. So I wear a few different hats. Been a Hood River County Commissioner for 16 years, working mostly on water and natural resource issues. I was a co-founder of Farmers Conservation Alliance, which is a nonprofit that works basically in energy and water conservation and efficiency within agricultural systems around the West. And then I'm a manager for a much smaller irrigation district. We're about 6,000 acres, so not even 1/10 of what Scott's district is. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a background on the Hood River Basin before I start. We're located just about 20 miles east of here. Our basin is pretty small, about 500 square miles, run from the top of Mount Hood down to the Columbia River, one of the smaller basins in the state. Our economy is primarily agricultural, so we grow mostly permanent crops: pears, apples, cherries, wine grapes. It's Sorry. There's a nice picture of pears. In terms of impact to the economy, we're about $300 million, which is a lot for a small county. There's only 24,000 people in our county. Also, we have a lot of ESA-listed species. So we have Chinook, coho, steelhead, bull trout, lamprey. So a big concentration of endangered species. We have, of course, a long history with the native culture in the region that rely on those fish. We also have recreational fisheries. And then recreation is another big facet of our economy that's been growing, and most of that recreation is based on water. And then lastly, timber. Historically, timber's been a huge part of our economy. Less so now, but still an important part. We have a massive amount of public lands that's primarily forest, which all of these pieces of our economy are directly impacted by climate change. And we have seen impacts to all of these different aspects of our economy. So in terms of our water, all of our agriculture is fed by surface water. It's a heavily glacially influenced system, so our reservoirs are primarily the glaciers on Mount Hood, and they've been receding for quite some time. So this is a picture looking up Elliott Glacier, Elliott Creek in the Hood River Basin. There's an irrigation diversion just below this point. And this is the other fun side of glacially influenced systems. That with glaciers that are receding, we have increasing frequencies of debris flows, which when you have diversions and fish screens right on the edge of the river, this tends to destroy all of your infrastructure. Our drinking water is primarily spring-fed. So we're basically, we have very few wells in our basin, so almost everything is surface water. So a little bit of history on the conservation side of things. We've had a really cooperative watershed for a very long time. So we've had a watershed group that's high functioning, that has members of the ag community, irrigation districts, folks from Confederate Tribes of the Warm Springs, folks from the timber industry, all working together. And so we've had about 30 years of good restoration projects, both in the riparian area, putting wood in streams, but also we've been piping irrigation systems and making improvements on irrigation systems, which has had a tremendous impact. So my district alone, we have in 30 years, we've gone from a completely open irrigation system to we have 2.5 miles of open canal left. So we put 70 miles of pipe in the ground at a cost of about $50 million. But what that's done for us is 30 years ago, when you compare what it took on a water per acre basis to where we are today, it takes us about half as much water per acre for the same crops. So when you're looking at a drought year, like we've had several in the past decade, if we were where we were 30 years ago with an open system, we would not be able to deliver the water that our growers need. And you can't go with permanent crops, you can't go a season without that water. So now in a drought cycle, our district is able to provide water to all of our growers all the way through the season, even in a severe drought year. So I'm going to talk a little bit about something that we did in our district, or excuse me, in our basin. It's been about 3 years ago now, I guess. So putting on my county commissioner hat now, we've had this collaborative basin. We have a good understanding of the issues around water resources and seeing drought years come and go and increasing frequencies of debris flows. And so our planning director came to me and said, hey, I have no idea how to plan for water. And got to thinking about the future, and he was looking at climate change issues. And so the county convened a water planning group. And it was really getting together all those folks that have a stake in water in one way, shape, or form. And we spent actually a few years floundering around. We were just basically taking all the existing information on water, so any studies, reports that have been done anywhere, trying to pull them together, see what work had been done. We eventually were able to get about $500,000 in grant funds, half from the Bureau of Reclamation, Water Smart, and half from Oregon Water Resources Department. And we were able to hire somebody to actually manage that process, and that's when we really started getting something done. So our goals were to look at all of these things, basically to look at where we are now, where we think we're going to be in the future, what opportunities we have to create resiliency within our basin so we can deal with variations in climate. So we did a climate change model. We had quite a bit of help. with the Bureau of Reclamation, we had access to their expertise, and with the Water Resources Department, we actually had $250,000 to spend on consultants. So it worked really well. We were able to utilize the Bureau's experience in many areas and then bring in consultants and others. So in our climate change modeling, we looked at these three different scenarios, really from a worst case to a best case scenario. So that climate change model then fed into all the other pieces of our water planning. And so we did a water use assessment where we looked at all the different uses of water currently, looked at water conservation. So what are those potential areas that we can have impacts in terms of improving efficiencies? We looked at water storage. And so this is one of the pieces that before we started this process, having that conversation about the potential for new storage, it was a topic that nobody really wanted to broach, and it had a lot of charged feelings about it. So that was included in it. We looked at additional storage, where that potential lied. And then we did a surface water model and a groundwater model, which, as it turns out, we know almost nothing about our groundwater in our basin. We have no big wells, and so we established a well monitoring program where we chose 60 locations around the basin strategically, and the county is putting in about half the funds for the long-term monitoring, and then Oregon Water Resources is providing the others. So all those pieces fed into our water resources model, and then we did quite a bit of habitat work, which was primarily headed up by the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs and ODF&W. And so basically we were looking at impacts to habitat and the species within our system with the various climate change scenarios. So this is one tiny piece, and I'll say Cindy Thiemann is going to be talking about this later today. She's our watershed coordinator. She's going to talk in quite a bit of detail about what we did and what that is taking us to in the future. So this is looking at one point in the East Fork, which is right above one of our irrigation diversions. So what you're looking at is the lowest line is where our flows will be late in the season in that reach if we don't do anything. And actually, it's with it's with the increase in demands that you get with climate change. And then if we didn't do anything and we had the same existing demands, that's the yellow line. The green line is if we implemented all of our identified conservation. And then the blue line is if we had conservation and storage in that. And so what it tells you is that we can have a positive impact down the road where we can minimize the effects of climate change. So by conservation and storage, it would allow us to save enough water in our system so that we could still supply our irrigation demands and our domestic water demands and maintain close to the same river flows late in the season, which was a big deal. I mean, it actually gave everybody a little bit of hope, I think. It gave me hope because it looks pretty bleak when you start looking at it in the beginning. So long term, we're trying to implement those projects that we identified. One of the things we did was we put a dollar per CFS onto all of our conservation projects and our storage projects. And that gave us a way to look at how to most appropriately spend the money that we had available. And so we're actually implementing those projects now. Our district alone got $3 million from Oregon Water Resources Department to expand our reservoir and to pipe another section, which will save a considerable amount of water and give us quite a bit of flexibility in how we operate. The nonprofit that I've worked for is actually taking this model that our irrigation district and another have shown is effective, which is piping and total efficiency. It can have a great impact, and taking that out into the western states. And they're currently working with a dozen irrigation districts around the state of Oregon to basically do this same analysis of what that conservation potential is within the system, what those benefits are, and then figure out how to fund it moving forward. So I'll leave you with this picture of Mount Hood. That is our reservoir system. That is what we want it to look like in the spring. And this winter so far, we're pretty hopeful. So thank you.
Kevin's up next. Thanks, Kevin.
Can you hear me okay? I tend to be kind of hot with mics because as he read, I was trained in broadcasting, so I'll try to keep it under wraps. First thing I want to say is this is going to be a little bit different presentation because it's not focused on an irrigation district. I'm a farmer, farming with largely groundwater, and so this is largely a groundwater focused presentation. But I'm also not a water expert, even though people in the wine industry seem to think I am. I'm what I'd classify as the one-eyed man in the kingdom of the blind. I had a business partner who always used to say that, drive me crazy with it, but I'm clearly the one-eyed man in the water world. And let me give you a little background first, because the presentation may not make sense unless I do. I've been in the Oregon wine industry for 37 years, and 34 of those have been farming in one way, shape, or form, primarily wine grapes. I'm now also in apples, and it's really the apples that led me down the water path so abruptly. I've largely been dry farmer for most of my life because wine grapes are pretty good at sourcing water out of the ground, at least in Western Oregon, because we tend to have adequate rainfall and adequate water holding capacity in our soils to get the vines through an entire growing season. I will tell you, in those 34 years, it's gotten a little more difficult. We see a lot more water stress in the late end of the season than we ever did in the 80s. Today it's not uncommon to see water stress in the Willamette Valley. So the game's changing, and we all realize that. I sold my original vineyard to a French firm in 2013 and took those proceeds and started all over again. Many of my friends think I'm the dumbest man alive, but I don't golf and I rarely get to go fishing, so I farm. That's what I like to do. Okay, so this new project was intended as a permaculture operation, and that sort of leads you down the path of having more than one commercial crop. So I chose cider apples after a lot of research, and then of course I had to do wine grapes because that's what I knew best. And I discovered I knew there were groundwater limited areas in the Willamette Valley, even though it seems somewhat counterintuitive that most of our groundwater limited areas are around the Willamette Valley, which is famous or infamous for rainfall, right? These are all pretty much hillside ground. The areas here on the west side of the valley are some of our most famous AVAs, American viticultural areas. They also happen to be groundwater limited areas. And I will tell you that most growers don't know they're growing on groundwater limited areas. And many of them, well, no, some of them are using groundwater for commercial purposes and really shouldn't be. But that's a whole nother story. Anyway, I'm right in this area here called the Walnut Hills, Amity Hills groundwater limited area, which I knew about this one, Eola Hills, and I thought that my property was outside of that groundwater limited area, so I could use groundwater to farm my apple trees. But I wrote a letter to the Oregon Water Resources Department, and they informed me, no, Mr. Chambers, you're correct. You are not in the Eola Hills groundwater limited area, this one right here. Your southern property boundary is the northern edge of the Eola Hills groundwater limited area, and you are in, lo and behold, the Walnut Hill, Amity Hills, Walnut Hills groundwater limited area. And long story short, you can't use groundwater for any commercial purpose, Mr. Chambers. Oh, I have a problem, okay? So this is a slide from the study done in the mid-60s that led the Eola Hills, Amity Hills, Amity Walnut Hills area to be groundwater limited. And it makes sense. I'm not going to argue with the decision of the Oregon Water Resources Board. My property happens to be literally right up here on the crown of the Eola Amity Hills. I went higher altitude because of climate change, and I hope I'm right. And my well is about 360 feet deep, right up here at the top. And these areas here that you can see are what we refer to as perched or semi-perched water tables, okay, groundwater. We have some concern that they could drain out if they're overutilized. Somewhat ironically, that all of the water in these hills largely fuels one of the largest irrigation districts on the Willamette Valley floor called the Palmer Creek District. But up here, we have very limited groundwater. This might be hard to see in the back of the room, but it demonstrates and describes, I think, one of the fundamental problems we have with groundwater management, or really water management, period, when we start looking at topography versus tax lots, okay? Here's my property right here, okay? And if you see, that's the crown of the hills. Matter of fact, I have one of the highest points in the entire hill mass. And you can see these really tight topographic lines coming off to the southeast. That's all vineyard now. And I thought it was just perfect for vineyard, and hopefully it will prove to be the case. I planted apples around the crown here. And this is an EFU, exclusive farm use zone, okay? So I have very tight regulations on what I can do with terms of building and that sort of thing. But you see all these little tight squares here? These are my neighbors. Those are 5-acre tax lots. Every one of them has a domestic well, okay? They can pull the same amount of water out of the ground as I can with my domestic well down here on this 80-plus acres. And so I said, well, how come we have all of this permitted, all of these housing development permitted in a groundwater limited area? And you have me as an exclusive farm use zone, but I can't use any groundwater for commercial purposes. And the response was, well, Mr. Chambers, the water law was created long after we had all these land use planning laws, or all these tax laws were determined long before we knew that we had limited groundwater. But, I still think it's pretty hard to farm in an exclusive farm use zone. Okay, thank you. When all my neighbors are draining the same aquifer that I am. Okay. So my answer was, okay, well, I had the additional problem of I did have a really nice place for a reservoir, but I found out that my title had a prescriptive easement right through this draw. And I contacted it accessed a piece of property that hadn't been touched in 25 or 30 years, but the people didn't want me to move their easement. I said, I'll build you a road, I'll do whatever's necessary. No way, I can't do that. So I couldn't do an impoundment. So the only option I had left was capturing rainwater. So this system that I have here can capture about 1 acre foot, and that's what I use to water my apple trees. So managing water by tax lots makes no hydrologic sense. I think that's obvious. I think John Wesley Powell told us that in 1880. Topographic management makes a lot more sense, but that requires that we cooperate over property lines. That's hard to do. Place-based planning, which I am trying to get involved in, really looks like a good solution, but those with existing water rights fear any change at all. I can't tell you how many calls to the Palmer Creek Irrigation District. The spring for which forms Palmer Creek is about 150 feet off my property line. And I've been able to talk to some people involved in that district, but I can't get to the decision makers because they don't want to talk about any change. Okay. Oops. Okay, and just because I felt some data about the wine industry was necessary, I know I'm out of time. This is some work I did with water use in the vineyard and wine industry in the state of Oregon. And really, I'm sorry, this isn't the state of Oregon, this is just the Willamette Valley. This is largely dry farmed. 75% of the acreage is dry farmed in the Willamette Valley. And you can see that wineries were using this is the counterintuitive number that I really want to share with you. And this is work that I did from 2 data sets. It's pretty limited information because there's only one a body that requires you to report water use from wineries. But I showed that wineries are using about 60 million gallons annually in our area, and vineyards were using about 15 million gallons. So the total industry was using in the Willamette Valley was using about 234 acre feet. Thanks very much.
All right. Jay. What's that?
Arrow up, arrow down.
This is one without an advancer, and then this is to advance.
Laser work. Yep. Good morning. Again, my name is Jay Gordon. I am a farmer in Chehalis Basin and have worked for a number of years for the dairy farmers in Washington. Bit a different, again, a little bit different. I think Liz put a pretty interesting, diverse panel together here with different perspectives. So I'll give you a little quick tour of my farm. This is my farm right here. This is my neighbors. This is a really nice greenhouse operation. This is the Chehalis Basin on December 1st, 2nd, somewhere like that, 2007. My family homesteaded this in 1872. This was the highest flood we'd ever seen in 145 years now. I got 5 more years to get to 150, and then we'll reconsider our investment. We're dealing with a little different effect of climate change than we've heard from some of the irrigation districts. On the east side, we have too much. So this was a dairy family. You can see the high water mark on the house. Never had water in the house. There's about 4 dairies on this road. All of the farmers and the families on the road ended up like lemmings going uphill to a dry place. The second floor of this house was the dry place. I think there was 28 people that the duck hunters and the steelheaders took out of this house in jet sleds and boats, and then finally the sheriff got there. But this house was leveled. The couple that owned it actually sold the farm. Their son wanted a farm, and they said no way. This is another family just you're about halfway between Chehalis and the coast. Pete Dykstra. So the high water mark on his place, can't quite see it in the slide, but it's right here. His previous high water mark was boot deep. So he had originally, his family been there a long time. They pulled the cows out of his barn from the rafters after they all drowned. And our Association of Farm Bureau helped put him back in business, and he's back milking cows again. He wonders why sometimes. Little different section of the Chehalis Basin after the flood. They took snowplows through to plow the silt out of the roads so we could get in and start getting farmers back to work. Interestingly, actually, this field now is pretty decent grass field once again. This is Pete and Cindy Dykstra's also. They had about I think Pete and Cindy and all their dogs were rescued out of that roof of their house. And again, the high water mark the family had seen prior to that was somewhere around the yard getting wet. Starting in 07, but really starting many, many years before that, I'll get to that in a minute in a slide. Here was the 07 flood. But here was the, 86 flood, the 90, either spring or fall of 90, the 96 flood. I think many of you saw that one. It was a nice snowpack followed by a Pineapple Express and a heck of a flood. Same thing here. And what we started looking at was there appears to be a trend for most people. It might not be, but after 5, you start wondering if it's a statistical anomaly. So my family, again, has lived in the Basin. My grandfather, I know, after the floods in 33, I think back in here, 33, 34, 35, there was a series of floods. So the valley got together and Corps of Engineers had meetings and irrigation districts, and this is our history in the Basin. We do a study and then a report, and then we forget, and then we do a study, and then we get another flood, and then we do another study, and then we do a flood, and then we do a report, and then we run out of money, and then we forget, and then we flood again, and we fight sometimes in between. And then we do it all over again, and then we get mad at the Corps, and we throw them out of the valley, and then we fight, and then the tribes fight with the farmers, and then the cities fight with each other. It's fun. It's a blast. I was telling Bill Dewey, speaking a minute, in about 2010, the Corps of Engineers had dusted off a plan that they had started in the 70s, and had spent $15 million to design a solution for Shellfish and Centralia by putting walls and levees around the city. And they'd spent $15 million getting to 35% design capacity, and in an auditorium in 10 or 11, they stood up and said, we're 35% design capacity. And we finally got them to answer the question, are the walls and levees above or below the 07 flood? And the answer the Corps gave the community was, in some places the walls are above, in some places they're below. And 1,200 people in an auditorium said, you spent $15 million and 60 years to tell us you've designed a bathtub. Get out. We need to decide as a community what we're going to do. A lot of information out there, and for most of us, some of you in the science community, bless your heart, we need that information. Do need to translate it a little bit. Sort of a confusing mess, but you know, when we look back at this one kind of is information that we can understand as a farmer in a community. We feel it, and the numbers match, and buried behind it is good information, and that'll be, I'll hate ending my speech with my theme, but you know, we all need good information upon which to act, and I was real impressed with the folks in Hood River, you know, really looking at that information so that we, instead of not acting, we have good information behind, you know, dumb it down a little bit for us, but behind it, it needs to be good information that we can reliably take a look at. In addition to flooding, the Shellfish does not have an ESA listing. We're the second largest basin in the state of Washington. We don't have an ESA listing, but we don't have a very good salmon run. And the chairman of the Shellfish tribe, Dave Burnett, was and still is my neighbor. And after the floods, Dave and I talked, and the tribes are getting flooded and losing fish, and we're getting flooded. And so we started working together with the encouragement of Governor Greg Warner as a community and say, what do we need to do? And let's us decide what we want the future to look like instead of some office in Seattle or somebody else. And so we've been working on an integrated plan very similar. We plagiarized fairly heavily from the process in Yakima. The farmers and the tribes over there developing a plan. So the Chehalis put together a plan similar, forming an office of Chehalis Basin, very similar to the office of Columbia River, to try and address the goal of how do we reduce the damage from catastrophic floods and restore the degraded habitat for aquatic species in the Chehalis Basin. There's a picture of I-5 going through Chehalis in that 07 flood. And so my plea and my question and my hope is we have had to use, we had to learn to rely on good folks. I'm part of a team called the Ruckelshaus Center, and we've used University of Washington and WSU extensively to get us that good information upon which reasonable people can make a decision. We've seen a lot of projects, and the tribe does not want an oops 20 years from now going, you know, we missed that and the Chinook are gone. We don't want an oops 20 years from now. We didn't quite get the modeling right. We're heading into a wetter, wet, drier, dry pattern, but how wet, how dry? Saw some of the modeling. We don't want to have an oops 20 years from now and look back and say, oops, we missed it. Just an example of the extremes that we're dealing with. So in Chehalis, just upstream, we have a river gauge at Curtis, not far from those barns that you saw. In '07, the river gauge finally broke at almost 60,000 CFS. And 18 months later, in August, that same stretch of river had 12 CFS. So our solution is get done with Bertha in Seattle, we'll bore a tunnel through to Yakima, and we'll ship the water over to you guys.
Beautiful. Thank you, Kat.
Well, it's a hard act to follow. My name is Kat Brigham. I'm here to talk to you about from the tribal perspective. And as you can, what I'm going to do is show you some of the pictures of my family fishing. But first, in this picture here is a scaffold of my grandson and my husband fishing there at Cascade Locks. And we have been fishing for generations. As Kevin stated earlier, my husband fished at Celilo when it was inundated prior to its inundation in 1957. And so we have fished on the Columbia River for many generations. And during the fishing seasons, we've definitely had our ups and downs. When we have good salmon runs, we have good seasons, and when we have poor, we have poor. That's just the way it is. But fishing is a part of our culture, our history, and our way of life. It's part of our 1855 treaty. When the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation signed an 1855 treaty, it gave up 6.4 million acres of land, but it also reserved certain rights, and one of those rights was fishing in all of our usual and custom areas. And the Columbia River is one of our usual and custom areas. And because it's a reserved right, the tribe, the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation's Fish and Wildlife Commission adopts the regulations in which our fishermen fish. And we follow those regulations. We look at our tribal regulations versus state and federal regulations. And so states don't adopt tribal regulations, and neither do the feds. The tribes adopt those regulations for fishing seasons to occur. We have 3 different types of seasons. One is for ceremonial, whereas we issue permits to tribal fishermen to go fishing on the Columbia River, and these fish are brought back home. Oh, am I going too fast? And these fish are being brought back home for ceremonials, for our feasts, for our namings, for our memorials, and for our funerals. I don't know how to work this. Huh?
Sorry. I think the way it's set, that you had said, I thought maybe you wanted.
Okay.
Probably a good way to go about it would just be to take the transition.
Okay. Well, we'll fix
wanna
this.
just keep on talking.
And anyway, we also have a subsistence, and our subsistence fisheries where we fish for ourselves or we fish for other tribal members. And then during a subsistence season, we are allowed to sell fish to other tribal members for their own personal use. The other one is a commercial season where we sell fish to everybody. We're open to the public. And these fish we can also sell over the bank. So we've had tribal fishermen selling fish over the cooler, out of their coolers to you as general public. And so that's what we have done for generations. I'm going to go back to the beginning of the slides. Oops. Okay, so and this isn't Cascade Locks. This is my 2 daughters and my grandson. We have scaffolds there and the Cascade Locks where we fish. And these are fisheries that have occurred, like I said, for generations. And again, this is my husband and my grandson. And this is my granddaughter and my great-grandson, who's also learned how to fish. He's actually stood on a scaffold and fished with his mom. And these are my daughter and my 2 grandchildren who are catching fish and taking care of it. And the types of fish we have is 3. We have more than 3. We have the scaffold fishing, and then we also have the gill net fishing. And these are where we fish with nets on the Columbia River, and this has been done for generations as well. I know some people say we didn't do this at Celilo, but we did. And this is my daughter and my grandson and my granddaughter and my husband who are putting fish, going out to the river or getting fish and pulling the nets and putting the nets out. And again, this is my husband and my granddaughter, or my granddaughter and my daughter and my grandson. So like I said, it's a family thing where we all go fishing. Now, when low water does occur, this is what happens. When what are the impacts of climate change? When we have low water, we can't go fishing. It's as simple as that, because our nets are not able to fish, the water's too slow, and when you have low water, the currents are slow, and then the other thing is when we have plant growth, and because of the plant growth in the Columbia River, at one time, our elders told us, when we fished at Celilo, we always had a dipper. And that dipper was there because we would take that dipper and put it in the water and drink the water from the Columbia River. In the 50s, we started getting sick, and so we quit drinking the water. And so, but then we were still able to fish. And when we fished, we were able to put our nets in there. And like when I married my husband, we were able to put our nets in on Monday and pull them out on Friday, and they'd still be clean. We wouldn't have to clean them. And then eventually we would have to put them on Monday and pull them out on Friday and then wash them with the hose because they were dirty. Today, we have to pull our nets out of the water, and as you can see with the spray here on the net, we're power washing those nets to get the debris out of the water, out of the nets, so the nets can be fishing. And this one where my daughter and my grandson are there, they're running the net, but they're shaking the as much as they can because to put that net back in the water, because that's one of the nets they're able to keep going. But then there's also the picture of what they look like when they're done. And when we're done, we're brown. Browner than brown. We're really filthy. But this is some of the fish we catch, our Chinook and our sturgeon. And then because of our work that we've done, we've been working with the Port of Cascade Lakes and the City of Cascade Lakes. We have opened up Brigham Fish Market, and this is my family again fishing. And so having all of these things is having an impact on all of us. And I know as a past tribal leader, one of the things we did work on was the Columbia River Treaty and fish consumption rate. Both of those are very important. I also know that not one tribe, not one state, or not one federal agency can address climate change. This is something we have to do together. And one of the biggest hurdles, I believe, is getting people to believe. If they don't believe that we're having climate change, nothing is going to happen. And if people believe and then start working together, then we can find a solution on how to address climate change. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. This is to advance.
Yep.
There's a
pointer.
Yeah, there's a pointer there, and here's one if you just want that.
Great, thanks.
Well, good morning, everybody. appreciate the opportunity to come and talk this morning at this important conference. Shellfish growers think of water very differently than terrestrial farmers do. We don't have to irrigate our crops. We're growing animals that are filter feeders in that water. We're more concerned about contaminants that might be in the water or the water chemistry than we are about water quantity. The tide takes care of that for us and brings that water back in. So just to go through some of those concerns, because these are just some pictures from our farms around the west coast here in Washington State in particular. These are all at high tide. All of these shots would be under anywhere from 10 to 20 feet of water. So again, the tide takes care of irrigating our crops for us. Some of the finished products that you may be familiar with when you go to the restaurants or take them home to eat them. Clams, oysters, mussels, gooey duck are the main ones farmed here in Washington State. So in recent years, we've become, historically we've been concerned about pollutants in the water. So failing on-site septic systems, stormwater runoff, ag runoff. That's how I've become very good friends with Jay, working with him and his dairymen to address water quality concerns from the dairies. More recently, we've become concerned with the water chemistry. So as we emit carbon from burning fossil fuels, most of that's absorbed by the atmosphere, but roughly 25% of it is also absorbed by the ocean. And we used to think that was a good thing because what was being absorbed by the ocean wasn't affecting the climate. But what we've come to learn here in the past decade or so is we're actually changing the chemistry of the ocean as that carbon is absorbed by the ocean. So since the beginning of the industrial era, we've increased the acidity of the surface water of the ocean by about 30%. And more importantly, for shellfish growers and for the shellfish that we grow, we've decreased the availability of carbonate ions by about 16%. So that's one of the chemical changes when the CO2 is absorbed by the ocean, is a reduction in these carbonate ions, which are the building blocks of the shells of the animals that we grow. Big deal for shellfish growers, for sure. And by the end of this century, they predict that we will have increased the acidity of the surface waters of the ocean by 100 to 150% and decreased the availability of carbonate ions by about 50%. So we see currently on the west coast of the United States, because we're an upwelling system, we see these conditions that are predicted for the end of the century. Actually, now when we have upwelling events, we're seeing these levels that are predicted for the end of the century. And it's having an impact on our ability to grow our shellfish. So this is the seed production in our hatchery. We bring the adult animals into the hatchery, we condition them, and we spawn them. And the first 3 weeks of their life, they're planktonic. They're free swimming in water in tanks in the hatchery. And this turns out to be the stage of their life when they're particularly vulnerable to ocean acidification. So if there's abundant carbonate ions, this is day one after the egg has been fertilized. And on the left is what a healthy oyster larvae looks like. You can see that shell is nice and round and concentric. And on the right is what happens when we have this upwelled water come into the hatchery and there aren't enough carbonate ions in the water. That larvae struggles to build its shell. It's doing all of this with energy that's stored within the egg, with lipids that are stored within the egg. So it struggles to build that shell. And more importantly, what happens is it runs out of energy that's stored in the egg before it gets to build its feeding organ so that it can get more energy and continue to live. So this velum, this feeding organ, it runs out of energy trying to build its shell, doesn't build that velum, can't get any more energy, and it dies. And so we were having a major issue with our hatchery and another one of the major producers on the West Coast. In 2008, 2009, our production in our hatcheries was off by about 75%. As we were learning about what this issue was and how it was impacting our industry. We've also learned that for mussel farming, so mussels hang on to our farms with these byssal threads, the hairy threads that you see on the side of mussels. In a higher CO2, warmer ocean, those byssal threads get weaker and the mussel shells get thinner. So the mussels slough off the farm, fall to the bottom, and get eaten by predators on the bottom underneath the rafts that we grow the mussels on. The response from our industry has been panic initially as we learned what this issue was. Clearly, carbon pollution is way beyond our capacity as an industry to deal with. It's coming from all over the world. So that was a pretty daunting message to learn. As we've ramped up our monitoring and research, we've learned now that there's ways that we can treat the hatchery water and increase the carbonate ions in the water in the hatchery and get our oyster larvae to successfully grow their shells. So we're back in seed production. We found a workaround here. Also working with the University of Washington and Oregon State University on breeding ocean acidification resistant oysters. We have a hatchery over in Hawaii, and we've expanded production at that facility to offset losses we've had here in Washington. And then we've also been experimenting, because as conditions get worse, it's going to start to impact the animals in our nurseries and on our farms. So we've been experimenting with co-culturing with seaweed, which sucks up carbon dioxide, and it's a natural way to mitigate the impacts of ocean acidification around our crops out in the bay, where we can't control that seawater chemistry like we can in the hatchery. This is an issue that's gotten a lot of media attention. It's a problem that's caused by carbon pollution that's totally separate from climate change and sea level rise and things like that you hear so much about. It's a totally separate issue that's caused by this carbon pollution as it's absorbed by the ocean, and it's gotten a lot of media attention, and it's turned out to be a good way to get policymakers' attention to the carbon issue. People that might be climate deniers, skeptical about climate change. When you present the chemistry and this issue to them, it's pretty straightforward, and it's hard to deny what's happening there. So we've gotten a lot of attention to this. We've had great response from our policymakers. Governor Gregoire formed an ocean acidification blue ribbon panel and came up with a plan to address it here in Washington State. It was the first government in the world to step up to do something about ocean acidification, so this plan has gotten international attention. I've been around the world to speak on it myself, and this experience that we've had is some amazing opportunities speaking at the United Nations and to audiences that actually can make a difference on carbon pollution, to tell our story about what's happening here. And we've been just really fortunate with the public policymaker response here that the legislature in 2013 passed legislation to create this Marine Resources Advisory Council in Governor Inslee's office, which is addressing ocean acidification. And they also established an Ocean Acidification Center at the University of Washington that's doing research to help our industry, but also understand how ocean acidification is impacting other important marine resources here in Washington State. The other issue we deal with as an industry is sea level rise. I mentioned that water quality is really important. These filter feeders that we're raising take in any kind of pollutants that are out there in the water, and that'll make them unsafe for us to sell and for people to eat. So as sea level rises and we get these big high tides that go up into people's yards, you can see the septic systems get inundated, filled with seawater, and they no longer work. And then the tide goes back out and sucks all that pollution back out into the bay and closes down our growing areas. And that's going to be happening more and more frequently as we get these increasing high tides and sea level rise. So I beat my clock. Good. Catch us up here.
And on that note of beating the clock, we're going to just go into the break. We have Mary Lou coming up next, and we're going to go into the break a little bit and cut into the following John Abatsaglu's following presentation just by 5 minutes. But it's hard to cut these presentations short. There's such fantastic folks up here. Oh, Mary Lou. Perfect. Thank you. Advancing, and then here's all these are pointers.
Advancing is right. That one right there. Does that work? Yeah. Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Mary Lou Soscia. I'm with the Environmental Protection Agency. It's nice to be here. I thought maybe I might not be able to be here, but I am. So I am. I got clearance. So I'm happy to be here. And I have a strong heritage with agriculture. I went to 2 land-grant universities. I started out my career working with farmers in Western Maryland with the soil conservation districts, and I some of my greatest work in my career has been with agriculture, so it's a real honor to be here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about water quality. I think as you know, we've been talking about a lot about water quality, and then as I look through the agenda, there's going to be a lot of conversations about water quality, and I think that, you know, we've already had this conversation already a little bit this morning, but I think that, you know, as we look to the future, you know, some of these really big water quality issues are going to be more, they're going to be increased stressors, you know, as we look for, you know, as we deal with a changing climate. So I'm just going to talk about some of the priority water quality areas that we've been focusing on at EPA in the Columbia River Basin over the years, and that we're going to continue to focus on. So the three areas I'm going to quickly run through, I'm going to talk a little bit about total dissolved gas, water temperature, and then also I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking about toxics, because that's where we've had a collaboration in the basin and a lot of partnerships and some successes, and looking forward to more of that in the future. So as Kat Brigham mentioned, something that's really important to EPA is, you know, working with tribes, and in the Columbia River Basin, you know, there's salmon are kind of iconic in the basin. They're really important to tribes, but also, you know, salmon are really they're really good indicators of ecosystem health. So I think the relationship with water quality and salmon is really important, that I just want to mention. And I think Kat did a really good job of covering this issue. So just running through the three areas, with total dissolved gas, that's something we've been paying attention to for a really long time. We're going to continue to pay attention to it. States have water quality standards for total dissolved gas that is generated by spill over dams, and that spill could either be voluntary or involuntary. The science is showing that fish can deal with about 120% total dissolved gas, and so some states have set up some processes to allow variances during certain types of spill events. And the Corps monitors that. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers monitors total dissolved gas. NOAA is in charge of the science. And so we're going to continue, EPA is going to continue to pay attention to that. And there's some consistency issues that we've been looking at in the Columbia River, and we're going to pay attention to that to sort of make sure that we can go as high as we can on that total dissolved gas, so that doesn't become a stressor in the system. Water temperature. Water temperature is really key, and I know in agriculture it's really key, and a lot of the work that a lot of farmers have been doing. We have water quality standards for temperature that meet aquatic life criteria. Water temperature is a really key ecosystem health indicator, just like it is, you know, just like temperature is an indicator for our own bodies, and it really affects distribution, health, and survival of fish species. And I think it is common knowledge that climate change can greatly affect water temperature. We already heard about 2015. We saw an incredible, I think a lot of folks know, and some of it happened near here. We saw an incredible extirpation of the sockeye runs in 2017 as a result of the very high water temperatures that we saw that year in the Columbia River. So we're going to, we've been working, in 2016, we started working with a lot of folks to sort of increase attention to water temperature issues. And we're going to continue that in 2017. We've been in conversations with the Corps of Engineers and other agencies about how we can work together to come up with some better collaborations. A really important work effort that we're doing right now is we're assessing, we're identifying, we're inventorying and identifying cold water refugia in the Columbia River system. So we're working with the Port of Cascade Locks, and we're working with a lot of different entities to identify where we know that there are pockets of cold water that fish, need during summers like 2015, and then we can figure out how we can work together to protect those areas. So we're going through this assessment and identification process, and that work is expected to be done, I believe, in 2018. But if you want more information on that, let me know. So I mentioned that I was going to talk a little bit about our toxics reduction work, and I think that's been something that's been a successful effort. We have a collaborative watershed effort to reduce toxics. We have a working group, which is a whole bunch of folks that have been working together with us over a number of years, since about 2005. We have a State of the River report. I'll tell you a little bit about the action plan. And then of note, of great import, is that at the end of 2016, the Columbia River Restoration Act passed as a part of the Water Resources Development Act, and it was a coalition of the Northwest River Partners, the ports, the Estuary Partnership, Salmon Safe, and other folks advocated for that, and that legislation sets up a future grant program to do toxics reduction and restoration efforts. There was no authorization or appropriation, so at this point in time, we're not going to be setting up that grant program, but it sets a framework for future work efforts, which is very exciting. So for the toxics, sort of the history is there was a fish contaminant study in 2002, and we looked at tribal fishing sites, like the site that Brigham referenced at Cascade Locks. We looked at anadromous and resident fish, and we saw a lot of contaminants that have pretty significant human health and also aquatic life impacts: PCBs, dioxins, furans, arsenic, mercury, and DDE, which is a breakdown of DDT. And then, just a couple years ago, folks right near here may know that there was a cleanup that was done at Bonneville Dam, but that cleanup didn't get everything. So there are some fish advisories at Bonneville Dam that are really significant. So we did a State of the River report for toxics in January 2009. We looked at 4 contaminants: mercury, DDT, PCBs, and PBDEs. And, we tried to come up with some collaborative solutions for how we solve those problems. We did an action plan for reducing toxics in 2010, and we came up with 61 actions of really collaborative type of actions on how we can reduce toxics. And then there's some positive things going on out there, and I'm going to go through fast because I got my time signed. So I'm going to just run through some of the things. Yakima River DDT, there was a 20-year goal set to reduce DDT. The Roza Sunnyside Joint Board of Control, working with Washington Ecology and the Yakima Nation, actually reached that 20-year goal in 5 years. Fish advisories were lifted. It was a big success story. We have pesticide stewardship partnerships. I think you're going to hear about that later on today. We've seen a 95 to 97% reduction in organophosphate pesticides with farmers using best management practices, so that's been really successful. There's Salmon Safe is just an amazing partnership with farmers, certification program. There's a lot of momentum going on in the Northwest, but more specifically, there's been a lot of work with farmers and promoting sustainable agriculture, using pest management strategies, irrigation, water use and reductions, riparian wetland management, and erosion and sediment control. And then just, some of the there's lots of great farmers out there that I've met over the years, but some of the ones that I've been really impressed with, Ted Castillo at the Bethel Heights Vineyard in Oregon. He was one of the first Salmon Safe certified farms in 1996, and he's sort of a leader in sustainable agriculture. Another one that folks may know, Ron Brown, who is just somebody I'm just so fond of, and they just sold the farm recently, but they have, and I know he and Kat Brigham are really close. They have they're a multi-generational business, and they've been really, supporting a lot of sustainable agriculture throughout the Walla Walla Basin. So last one is green infrastructure. We've got a lot of opportunities with green infrastructure, a lot of new technology. I really believe that some of the flooding problems that, like Chehalis, there are opportunities there with green infrastructure, and we need to look at those kind of approaches. So, final message, I'm out of time. Pay attention to water quality as you move forward on these issues. There have been a lot of successes. We have an opportunity to do a lot more, and thank you so very much for letting me talk to you today.
So if the panelists could come back up, we have time for questions. Any first questions?
Was me? I'm sorry. My hearing's terrible. I didn't hear the question.
The big tank, how much did that cost?
Okay, well, those tanks are about $1 a gallon, so it's a 10,000 gallon tank, so it's a lot of money. I got them for a lot less than that because some people owe me favors. The rainwater catchment system, sort of like a dam, is largely once you've built it, it just keeps refilling. So over time, the cost per gallon goes down substantially.
Yeah, hi, really nice talks, I appreciate it. More for the first kind of half of speakers. Could you estimate like a cost of water in your respective areas when it's a wet year and how that changes as it goes to a dry year, sort of the range?
Well, the assessment for our irrigation district is $176 per acre. That's medium-high in our basin. Order of magnitude, the higher districts are up around $225. The lower districts are probably in the $50 to $60 range. If a person and now remember, those are our O&M costs to get the water delivered. If a person wants to buy a water right, order of magnitude, you're looking at probably $1,700 an acre foot, plus or minus. When we were leasing water during the 2015 drought, we were paying $500 per acre. That got us about 2.1 acre feet per acre. So, what that runs out to about $225 an acre foot, plus or minus. We paid $300 per acre in 2005 for that same 2.1 acre feet.
So we're a little cheaper. We're $112 an acre, $110 an acre. We are on the high end for our basin. There's the cheapest district in the basin is $37 an acre. And that's what you'll see with irrigation. It varies, down to just a few dollars an acre around the state. In drought years, we basically try to pinch everybody back. And so we try not to go on rotation, but in 2015, we did put our district on rotation. And so basically all the farmers take turns, and they'll get water like every third day. And so our district functions a little differently than some of the bigger districts. We don't have the opportunity to buy water. We basically have what we have. And so we've been working as a basin to look at opportunities to curtail on lands that we can curtail on. So annual crops and being able to buy back acreage in a drought year basin-wide.
Just so you know, to do rainwater catchment cost me about $2 a gallon initial installation, but as I said, it goes down over time.
Order of magnitude, the Lake Cochise project that I showed you at the end of the last couple slides I had there, order of magnitude, if that's a $200 million project, more or less, to get 200,000 acre feet, that equates to $1,000 an acre foot, and the bulk of our growers are ready to pay that, plus the operational costs.
Mr. Dewey, I was curious as what species of oyster is being bred to be resistant to ocean acidification, and secondly, what's the timeline and concern about invasiveness of that species?
So the species is the Pacific oyster, which came originally from Japan. The industry introduced it in the early 1920s, and it's naturalized here, and most people would recognize it as a native oyster. And it's fortunate that it's not, actually, that it is an introduced species, so we can work with the genetics. If it was a native species, we wouldn't be able to do that. So, for instance, with our farmed gooey duck, we can't, because that's a native species, we can't have a genetics program to try to improve that stock. But with the Pacific oyster, non-native, we can.
Timeline?
Good question. I'm not up to speed on both the work at UW and OSU on that, but it'll be a few years for sure. Yeah, but I think we have time. As this progresses. As yet, it's not impacting our adults out on our farms or our juveniles in our nurseries that we're aware of. And so we've got some time to work on this.
So my question is for the two gentlemen and managed irrigation.
talked a lot about conserving water by piping your ditches and doing improvements in the leaking in your ditches. Do you do anything about conservation at the field level? Is there any, I know in California there are regulations that prohibit flood irrigation in certain kinds of situations, and I know there's lots of difference in water use in different applications of water, so I'm curious about what you're doing about that.
Generally speaking, our responsibility stops at the weir blade once we deliver the water. We have worked with the state of Washington in the 80s and into the 90s with an on-farm loan program to help with sprinkler conversions. So the Roza system, along with all the other bureau systems in the basin, were developed for real irrigation. So that's the little furrows you see, and so that's a step above kind of flood irrigation. But by and large, it's not terribly efficient. So through those, particularly the open ground farmers, and we still have, I think we're down to about 1% of the district, plus or minus, that's in rail irrigation. It's almost, I think it's all open crops, things like mint or hay, maybe corn in a couple of instances. It's going away. Probably in 10 years it'll be zero, I would expect. We're fortunate that we've got 15,000 acres of grapes in our district. All of and about 11,000, I think roughly 11,000 of those are wine grapes. There's a pretty low water crop. So not only is it a low water crop, those are almost all drip irrigated. Many of the juice grapes are converting to drip irrigation. Many of those grape growers also grow things like hops and apples and other soft tree fruits. So they have an incentive because that's part of the reason in our district that they want to manage the water season so that there's water available at the end, because particularly the wine grape growers, their view is, hey, Irrigation District Board, we're using less than half of the normal water allotment. You really need to be taking care of us at the end of the season. And so they don't have a whole lot of sympathy for the hay growers and the corn growers if we turn the water off in the spring. And part of the reason for timing it in the spring for the shutdowns is, weather's pretty variable. And, in 2015, for example, we were pretty lucky. We got a pretty good shot of rain in the middle of that.
So our basin, as I said, mostly is in tree fruit permanent crops. Our district is over 90% converted to micros, to efficient irrigation, and it's a range with the other irrigation districts. Some have not moved as far. Our district has incentivized growers, and another district also does that. Soil and Water Conservation District and Watershed Group, that's one of the main things that we work on throughout the year is targeting those areas that we can get funding in to help growers convert. So we've been actively working at it. It is when we did our basin study, that on-farm conservation was some of the cheapest conservation that we could do when you compare it to piping and then reservoir expansion. And so that's definitely low-hanging fruit, and that's the area we keep working as a basin towards is to get that on-farm use down as far as we can. It also, as we've found, it improves crop quality. So when farmers are putting on the right amount of water, not putting on too much water, their inputs are lower and their crop quality goes up. And so getting that message out to growers, you've got generational changes that have to happen, and that's happening. You've got some growers that have been growing for a long time who are stubborn and resistant to change, but slowly they're moving out and the next generation's moving in, and they tend to be a little more driven to look at new technologies.
Yeah, one thing I would also add, if you were to drive through the Yakima Valley, either the middle of the valley or drive through Ellensburg, particularly on a hot summer day when it's windy and you see people irrigating, and I often get these questions. People say, well, don't they know about evaporation? Well, they do know about evaporation, but the ones you can see from the freeway have senior water rights, so they really have no incentive to conserve. And perversely, in some instances, not only do they not have an incentive to conserve, if the higher up in the basin they are, the more inefficient they are, the better it is for those of us at the bottom, because those return flows are all captured and reused. All the water in the basin is used several times. And it's often forgotten that even at the Roza Dam, which is in the middle of the basin between Yakima and Ellensburg, in a drought year, we actually rely on water that's already been used upstream. So the more inefficient it is in the Kittitas Valley, the better for us. Our water is actually used again later downstream when it's collected by the Kennewick Irrigation District at Prosser Dam. So you have to kind of be ready to embrace the counterintuitive.
All right, let's thank the panel, and